This man is on his knees throughout the entire book in more ways than one. Hi, I'm Kat. We talk books here, and I am currently making my way through all the Bridgerton books. Today we're talking about When He Was Wicked by Julia Quinn, which is the 6th book in the Bridgerton series, and it is Francesca's book. The last one I did was Benedict Bridgerton's book, and next we'll do Eloise, which I'm saving for last because I have heard so much about Sir Philip, and all of you have been telling me that I will hate the guy, so we'll save the worst for last. I was really excited to start Francesca's book because everyone has been telling me that this is the best Bridgerton book and that Michael, who is the hero of the book, is their favorite Bridgerton man. And if you've watched my other videos, you know that I have not been a fan of the Bridgerton men, but we do like Michael. We like Michael, right? I did go into the book with higher expectations, but the expectations were still like pretty low in general because I just haven't enjoyed the other books as much as I wished I had. Nevertheless, I did end up actually really enjoying it. I say I even loved it, but we will get into that. I'll be doing a pretty detailed summary with tons of spoilers, so if you don't want spoilers, just stop now. And then I'll share my thoughts on the book overall and also on the adaptation as we know it and what I hope to see in the adaptation for Francesca's season. Before we get into the video, as some of you know, I've been freelancing in social media and content creation for the past couple of years, and the thing about freelancing and working for yourself is that there are so many things that no one prepares you for, which is why I'm so excited to share that this video is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes led by industry experts across film, illustration, design, freelance, productivity, and more. One way I've been trying to stay on top of everything as a freelancer is organizing all of my projects within Notion, and this Notion masterclass on Skillshare has been a really engaging way to learn all of the different ways to get the most out of the platform. I've been using Notion for years, but this class taught me so many things I've never even thought about trying within Notion, like using widgets. I'm really excited to apply everything I've learned in the class to real life and hopefully get more organized and stay on top of all of the things I have to do as a freelancer. Whether you're in a creative career looking to start one or enjoy creative pursuits in your free time, Skillshare has a ton of different classes for you to discover new skills. If you're looking to really hone in on a certain goal, their learning paths are curated sequential collections of classes. Also, if you have any summer learning goals or just want to pick up new hobbies, Skillshare is a really great place to start. If you're already familiar with Skillshare, there are new improvements as well, such as smarter class categories, 3 new class topics, and the ability to search for classes by software and material. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so get started today. Our main characters are Francesca, who you already know, and Michael Sterling. Francesca has always felt a little different from her family. This is translated as her being neurodivergent in the show adaptation, which I really loved. I think it's a really great interpretation of this line from the book, which reads, "She was different. She'd always felt a little different from the rest of her family. Even though she looked like a Bridgerton on the inside, she always felt like a bit of a changeling." And Francesca finds a like-minded partner in John Sterling, the Earl of Kilmartin. One of the really important things about this story is that the relationship between Francesca and John is true love, and Francesca really loves John. And I think that's one of the things that the adaptation may have gone wrong, but we'll get into that later on in the video. One of the reasons why she loves John so much is that she feels like she can truly be herself with him. She adored him with every last breath in her body. He was her kindred spirit. It had, in a strange sort of fashion, been a relief to exit her mother's home to escape to a more serene existence with John, whose sense of humor was precisely like hers. He understood her, he anticipated her, he completed her. Their first meeting hadn't been one of overwhelming love or passion, but rather filled with the most bizarre sense that she'd finally found the one person with whom she could be completely herself. So enter Michael Sterling, who is John's first cousin, and he is known as the Merry Rake, that's his nickname. Everyone knows him as this really carefree man who loves to seduce women. But when he meets Francesca at a dinner celebrating her imminent wedding to his cousin John, he falls in love. It is love at first sight. There's no other woman for him from that moment on. But of course, Michael also really loves his cousin John, and so he is filled with all of this guilt and torment because he hates himself for wanting Francesca. So Michael resigns himself to never being with the woman he loves, but he tries to be a good friend to the couple and to Francesca. They have a little bit of banter banter where Francesca is always teasing him about all of his supposedly wicked adventures, but on the inside Michael is like, you're the only thing that matters to me and none of these other women even matter. So there is a lot of delicious yearning and pining on a part of Michael. Francesca and John are married for 2 blissful years, and then one day John gets a headache and takes a nap, and then he never wakes up from his nap. Julia Quinn writes in the author's note that he dies from an aneurysm, but in the book they don't know what that is, so all they know is that he just never woke up. So obviously Francesca is just so devastated, and Michael is also devastated because they both love John so much. But for Michael, there is another layer to this devastation, which is that he can't help feeling like somehow he manifested John's death. He hadn't wanted this. Had he? He'd wanted Francesca, that was all, but not like this, not at this cost. So he's constantly having this inner monologue that's like, did I wish for this to happen somehow? Is this my fault somehow? And Francesca, who in her grief wants Michael to be there for her because she feels like he's the only one who loved John the same way that she did, she's like, why is Michael pulling away? And then Francesca finds out that she's pregnant with John's child, but then unfortunately she has a miscarriage. After Francesca's miscarriage, she confronts Michael. She's so angry because he's been distant and she doesn't understand why. But Francesca lashes out, and at one point she says the baby was to have been yours in a way too, simply because she wants Michael to feel the depth of her grief and her loss for both John and the baby. Obviously this is coming from a really dark place for Francesca, but it's also emotionally manipulative for her to say to Michael, who has also just lost his cousin, and she doesn't know that he is in love with her. This is very emotionally triggering for Michael. He ends up putting his hands on her and kind of shakes her, saying like, I can't be him, I won't be him. But it's not like he's really there, he's just like so lost in his grief. And then he realizes that he is scaring Francesca, and then he's like, you have to go, so she leaves. This was a very, very difficult scene to read because they are both in such dark places. I did find the way that their emotions were written, it felt pretty realistic. I think that the way Julia Quinn handles grief throughout the book, as well as Francesca's feelings around her miscarriages and possible infertility, I think it is well written, and everything that happens as a result of those feelings makes a lot of sense. But more on that later. So after this, 4 years pass, and Michael has been in India the whole time. I guess he had to go like full colonizer in order to run away from his unrequited feelings. But after these 4 years where he's been taking on more responsibility and really doing some self-growth and reflection, he decides to come back to England and face reality. As for Francesca, she's been healing, finding peace within herself, and she feels like she's maybe not ready to move on from John, but she is ready to remarry because she wants to have a child. So that is her new goal in life. Francesca and Michael end up reuniting in London. They're both staying in the Kilmartin house in London because Francesca is still the Countess of Kilmartin because Michael hasn't remarried yet. And then Michael is now the Earl, so then they both live in that same house. But then Francesca is like, oh, propriety, so then she moves to her mother's house, the Bridgerton house. There is this one conversation early on where Francesca is talking about her reasons for remarrying, and she blames herself for the miscarriage. And of course, in this time period, and even today, honestly, women were often blamed for infertility and for miscarriages, or feel like they have to take the blame for it. Michael tells her, you mustn't blame yourself for the miscarriage, it wasn't your fault. So even though Michael wasn't there for her when she originally had her miscarriage, he is there for her now, and I really love this moment between them. I thought it was very sweet. After they have this bit of a heart-to-heart, Francesca looks at Michael and suddenly sees him in a different way. She suddenly sees him as someone who she could desire. And then this freaks her out, understandably. After this, Francesca kind of runs away, and then she goes to find her mom, Violet, and she asks her mom, why did you never remarry? Violet tells Francesca that she was in a different position than Francesca. She was much older, she already had kids, and that for Francesca, she still has this chance to remarry and have a family. Francesca says, I'm not going to find someone like John, I've accepted that. And then Violet says, you won't find someone like John, but you might find a man who will suit you equally well, just in a different way. And although this is excellent advice, it's something that Francesca isn't really ready to hear yet, because for her it still feels like a betrayal to even think about loving someone in a romantic way, in a way that is remotely close to what she felt for John. After this, Michael stands up the Bridgertons for dinner. He just doesn't show up, and Francesca's like, this is so unlike him, so she goes back to his house and finds out that he is in bed with fever because he has malaria. This means that every few months he'll get get like an episode where he'll have nightly fevers for days at a time, and then it goes away for another few months or however long between each episode. And the fevers only happen at night, so she stays with him throughout the night because she's so worried about him. But seeing him sick makes her feel a little less wary of being alone with him, because suddenly she's not thinking about like, oh, how attractive he is. She's like, oh my god, he's sick and I'm so worried about him. After this, Michael's mother and John's mother both arrive at the house in London, so then Francesca feels comfortable staying over at the house again. But once Michael is well, they both have to suffer through watching each other attract potential matches at balls because they are both looking to remarry this season. Michael has to suffer the indignity of his own parlor filling up with flowers from suitors for Francesca. And he is so jealous, he's like, can't marry this man. And Francesca's just like, teehee, okay. There's another incident where Michael goes to the gentleman's club and this really creepy man makes a really weird sexual comment about Francesca, and Michael all but strangles the dude. And then Colin, who is Francesca's brother, enters the scene. For some reason in this book, Colin is Michael and Francesca's biggest cheerleader, and he's also like clairvoyant, like he somehow knows exactly how they feel about each other, which I kind of love. I think it's really funny. Later on, after this very revealing conversation, Michael goes to a ball and finds Francesca being assaulted by a suitor in the garden. So he rescues her, and Francesca's all like, oh my god, I should have known better, I'm sorry. And Michael goes, well, he should have known better. And Francesca thinks he's upset about how she put herself in danger, but I think he's really upset because of his conversation with Colin. So they leave the ball early and go home. Francesca goes to find Michael in his bedchamber and is like, thank you so much for rescuing me. And Michael's like, you should leave. And she begins to confront him, and they have a bit of an argument, but they're getting closer and closer and closer. And then Francesca realizes he's going to kiss her. And she also realizes that she wants him to. But this fills her with so much guilt because she feels like it's a betrayal of John. So they do kiss, and it's a very good kiss for both people involved, until Francesca freaks out and she's like, I have to go, I can't do this. So she runs away. She runs away all the way to Scotland, to the Kilmartin estate. From Michael's point of view, he is in absolute inner torment. Now he knew exactly what he was missing. He understood with painful clarity just what it was that would never be his. And he really hates himself because he feels like maybe he was too pushy, maybe she didn't actually want the kiss, and he blames himself completely for ruining their friendship. So he actually attempts to go to a brothel, and just like, he can't get it up with anyone because all he can think about is Francesca. So Michael ends up back at the gentleman's club to drink his sorrows away, and who should be there but Colin Bridgerton, who is either always at the gentleman's club or he has an air tag on Michael. Colin is like, you know, there's no reason you can't marry Francesca except for the reasons you manufacture for yourself. And this is also the conversation where Colin reveals that he just asked Penelope Featherington to marry him. So this book is taking place concurrently with Colin and Penelope's book. And Michael's like, oh, did anyone tell Francesca? And Colin's like, no, well, she's in Scotland, so no one's told her yet. And Michael's like, oh, well, you know, someone should tell her. And Colin's like, yeah, someone should. So Michael sets off to Scotland with one goal in mind. He is going to ask Francesca to marry him. Once Michael arrives in Scotland, he proposes to Francesca like immediately, and he's doing so in a very like cool-headed, logical way because he's trying to appeal to Francesca's pragmatism. He knows that she's not there emotionally, but he wants to be able to lay out a good argument for their marriage so that she would say yes and that he would get to marry her, even if it's just to be able to be a good husband to her and to treat her well even if she doesn't love him back. He lays out his argument, and he's like, you wouldn't have to move. You could retain your title. You know I would treat you well, which you can't say for most men. And I will try to give you children. And then ironically, Francesca gets really upset about this proposal because he's being so cool-headed and logical. And she's like, how is he so chill about this? Because I'm freaking out. Why isn't he freaking out? And then for some reason, this is where Michael's like, I will have to seduce her into saying yes. And Francesca, who has been widowed for 4 years, hasn't had sex for 4 years, is very, very willing to be seduced. I found the intimacy scenes in this book a lot more enjoyable and fun than the scenes from the other Bridgerton books I've read, and that's because Francesca is more sexually experienced, so the scenes are a little less formulaic, and they really explore Francesca's sexuality in a way that I think connects to her emotional arc really well. So for example, there's a lot more of Francesca exploring her sexuality in ways that Michael specifically brings out in her, but she didn't have these experiences or these desires with John, and this makes her feel very, very guilty. And I think the intimacy is a really important way for Francesca in this book to learn that it isn't a betrayal of John, you know, to feel happiness and desire for someone else. But it is a long journey for her to get to that point. So Michael and Francesca are engaged in a physical relationship, with Francesca still unable to either say yes or no to marriage. Francesca is kind of just waiting to get pregnant, because if they get pregnant, then she has to get married to him. Part of her is hoping for that, but she also just can't say yes herself to the marriage yet. So Michael is also trying to treat her really well outside of the physical relationship. He brings her flowers and he's like, I'm courting you because you deserve no less. I love it when there is like a courtship phase in a romance novel. I feel like in some of the other Bridgerton novels there wasn't really a courtship phase because they needed to get married right away or etc. But in this book there is a courtship phase and it is very sweet. And Michael is trying to woo her in every way he can. This man is on his knees throughout the entire book in more ways than one. So this courtship phase for Michael is really allowing him to let go of his fears and helping him to process all of the guilt he felt after John's death. He finally allows himself to think, what would John think of all this? And he realized that his cousin would have given his blessing. Then Francesca gets her period and she realizes she's not pregnant. And she's really sad, but she doesn't know if it's because there's no baby or because it means she doesn't have to get married to Michael. At this point, Michael and Francesca get into a fight because Francesca is feeling really tender and vulnerable and rejects Michael when they are, you know, in bed. And then Michael, who doesn't understand the headspace that she's in, Michael feels very rejected because this whole time Francesca has been refusing to say yes. Michael orders Francesca to leave the house if she's not going to marry him. And he also confesses that he's loved her since she was with John. And he confesses in a way that's very like self-hating. He's like mocking himself for having those feelings. Francesca is obviously emotionally distraught and she leaves the room. Some time passes and then Francesca comes back and says that yes, she will marry him. And Michael asks her why and she's like, I don't know, don't make me figure out why. All I know is that I'm going to say yes to you. And it's because she hasn't confronted her own feelings around it yet. I think if anyone does have an issue with Michael, it would be in this scene where he basically gives Francesca an ultimatum and is like, if you don't want to marry me, just leave the house. And it's also entirely in his right to tell her to leave because he is the Earl, and technically when he remarries, Francesca would have to leave anyway. And Francesca she's obviously not worked through her feelings around the proposal. So while Michael's frustration is valid, it feels like a very aggressive way for him to push the issue when she's clearly not ready. But I also want to point out that Francesca, compared to the other Bridgerton heroines, does have a lot of agency because she is a widow, so she can just walk away from the relationship if she wanted to, which we can't really say for some of the other characters in some of the other stories. I did wish that Francesca had been in a better state of mind when she accepted the proposal. I think that like having it be an ultimatum, like obviously that's great for drama and high stakes in the book, but I guess I felt like the characters deserved better because they had been through so much, and I wanted them to have like a happier moment when Francesca finally said yes. But we do get happier moments of them together as a couple after this. Like I think this is like the roughest part of the book, but compared to the other Bridgerton heroes, Michael is practically a saint. Moving on, the rest of the book was my favorite part because it is finally about the characters healing and having, you know, like happy domestic moments, which I love fluff. It's the best. So Francesca and Michael actually decide to get married like right away. The marriage scene and the scene afterwards where they are, you know, finally together as a married couple is just really freaking cute. Like really cute. I really like this line when they have spent their night together and they're about to fall asleep. He murmured something against her neck and she couldn't really understand the words, but that didn't matter. She knew what he'd said. Julia Quinn, I did not know your game. I just love that depiction of love so much, just being so secure in someone's love for you. Yeah, it got me. It's really, really sweet. It got me. There's also this quote from right after they get married when they're meeting in his bedchamber. She was standing by the window clad in a nightgown of deep blue. The cut was modest, but the fabric clung, and for a moment, Michael couldn't breathe. And he knew. He didn't know how, but he knew that it would always be like this. He just loves her so much. But unfortunately, because this is a romance novel and we have still not reached the end of our characters' emotional arcs, the happiness cannot last forever and Michael gets a fever. They're really worried that it's malaria because if it is, it means that the episodes are becoming closer together and that could mean that he is dying. Julia Quinn writes in the author's note that this is not actually true, but this is what they probably believed back then about malaria. So Francesca is so distraught. She's just beside herself with worry that Michael is dying. It wasn't right and it wasn't fair that she should have to lose 2 husbands when so many women got to hold onto one for an entire lifetime. And most of those women didn't even like their spouses, whereas she, who actually loved them both, and this is the moment where Francesca realizes that she does love Michael. This thing between them, this bond, it wasn't just passion and it wasn't wicked. It was love and it was divine. So this is Francesca reckoning with the fact that her very passionate love for Michael isn't any less valid than her love for John, which was very different. It was different because they were different men, and she was different now too, but it was also the same. It was the love of a woman for a man, and it filled every corner of her heart. So after this really big emotional revelation for Francesca, it turns out that Michael is okay. Like, he wakes up and he still has a fever, but that means that it isn't a malaria fever because those only last for a night. The final stop for Francesca on her emotional journey of healing and realizing that it's okay to find love again is when she visits John's grave. I think for her it's really important to visit John's grave because, you know, after having this big revelation that she loves Michael, it's almost like she's seeking John's blessing. And as she's at the grave laying down flowers, she has this internal like clicking into place of her finally realizing that, you know, John would have been okay with it. In fact, he would have wanted it. He would have wanted her to marry Michael. He would have wanted her to marry any man with whom she'd fallen in love. But she rather thought he'd be almost tickled that it happened to be with Michael. They were his 2 favorite people, and he would have liked knowing that they were together. So she's talking out loud to John at his grave, saying, "I love him, I love Michael." She says, "I think you would approve. Sometimes I almost think you arranged the whole thing." I'm like gonna cry thinking about it, it's so sweet. And then who should appear but Michael himself, because he had gone out looking for her. So they finally have their moment where she tells him that she loves him, and they finally have worked through all of their problems together and within their own selves to find happiness and feel deserving of it, and it is so, so cute. I will admit that this book did make me cry, and it happened at the very end of the epilogue where John's mother is writing to Michael and congratulating him on the marriage. "Thank you, Michael, for letting my son love her first." This was definitely my favorite of the Bridgerton books that I've read so far. I liked how Julia Quinn explored these really big and intense emotions and the character arcs that she wrote for each of them. I thought that Francesca was a great heroine. I really love when Regency heroines are a bit more unconventional. For example, when they're sexually experienced or they have more like social standing in order to not be constrained by some of the really restrictive rules around propriety in that era. I feel like there was a lot more agency for her and it made the relationship more interesting and more equitable. I also, for the most part, really loved Michael because he is so down bad for Francesca. And I am such a sucker for yearning, and this book was like 100% yearning, like just pure yearn. Both of the characters are still flawed, but I think that their flaws make a lot of sense within the context of the trauma that they went through. I also like the fact that Michael took the initiative to grow and change and work on himself outside of Francesca, and Francesca also does the same on her own, so that when they do come back together, they are, you know, changed people. And then when they are together, they do change each other as well for the better. I liked how Julia Quinn wrote about the grief and the complicated feelings around grief and all of the guilt that is intertwined with that, because that is so real. I also liked how she addressed Francesca's fears around miscarriage and infertility, because that's something that so many women go through, and I think something that is really well explored within the context of a romance novel. Now, as for the show adaptation, after reading the novel, I can definitely see why book fans were upset about the initial introduction and what they did to Francesca and John's relationship at the very end of the last season. But I'm going to go through some of the things I did like first. So I did like the neurodivergent interpretation of Francesca and John and their relationship. I thought that was really well done. It made a lot of sense for their characterizations within the book. I really did fall in love with John, and I am really upset that he's going to die. So they definitely did their job right with the writing of his character and his casting and their chemistry together. Now, when it comes to Michaela, who is the gender bent version of Michael, I don't have an issue with the gender bending. I think it's actually pretty cool, and more thoughts on that later. But I do have an issue with how they set up the dynamics between Francesca, John, and Michaela. So in the book, as we just talked about, Michael falls first, and he is yearning, and Francesca is wholly in love with John. She is utterly devoted to him. In fact, that's one of the reasons why Michael loves her so much, is that he really admires her devotion to his cousin, who he really loves. So it did make sense to me why they would have Francesca meet Michaela in the show, and then have Francesca be the one who seemingly falls first. You have Violet talking about how when she and Edmund met, I think it was either her or Edmund who forgot their own first name, and that was how they knew they had like an instant spark. And then when Francesca and Michaela meet, it's Francesca who forgets her own name. And I don't know why they couldn't have just switched it and had it so Michaela forgot her own name, because that's also part of the reason why we love Michael as a character so much, is because he is this like charismatic rake, but when it comes to Francesca, everything else falls away. And so it would have been really nice to see Michaela introduced as this very charming, confident character, and then as soon as she sees Francesca, for her to, you know, be like stammering over her own name. I think that would have been very endearing, and it would have set up the story in a way that respects Francesca and John's relationship the way that it is in the book. And then when Francesca and John have their first kiss at the wedding, you get this look of disappointment that Francesca has, and I hated that, because in the book it is so clear that, you know, Francesca and John's relationship is really fulfilling in all ways, and that, you know, even though she has a more passionate relationship with Michael later on, she never felt like there was anything lacking in her relationship with John. Obviously the book and the show are different things, and we should take them as completely different stories, but I think that one of the reasons why book fans are upset about the direction that the show is taking with this particular story is because it kind of changes the message of the story, which is that all kinds of romantic love are valid, and that just because love is different, it doesn't invalidate the other kinds of love you may have had throughout your life, and that after having one beautiful kind of love, you can still find love even if you lose that. So it feels like by pointing out from the beginning that there's something lacking in Francesca and John's relationship, it is invalidating the fact that they did have this beautiful love, and that it is just as valid as like a more passionate kind of love. Especially when it comes to romance where it happens after loss. It's so much more impactful when the story respects that each kind of love is unique and beautiful in its own way. I don't know why they felt the need to set it up in this way. Like, is it not enough that John's going to die? Maybe it's just lazy writing or trying to make it like easier for the audience to digest, to be like, oh yeah, there's just one true love. But then it loses the nuance of a story like this, and the reason why a story like this is so beautiful. So thoughts on the gender bending. I do think it's interesting that they chose this story to gender bend. I think because of the issues of infertility and the miscarriages, I think it could be an interesting way to explore how those issues come about in sapphic relationships. Of course, it's a very different experience, but it's a really good opportunity to write these kinds of experiences in this show, and I think it can definitely be explored in that way. I think a lot of book fans were disappointed because they were so excited for Michael and to see who the show would cast as Michael, and like, can't blame you. Michael's definitely the best Bridgerton man. So I totally get the disappointment, and I get wanting to gender bend a story with a less beloved couple. For example, Eloise and Sir Philip. That being said, I think the actor they cast for Michaela is beautiful. I'm really curious how they would translate Michael's character to the show and how they'll make Michaela like a rake or whatever the equivalent of that would be for a woman in that time. I also think because Michaela is a woman, that her friendship with Francesca before John passes away, I feel like that could hit different. There are few situations with more intense yearning than like a sapphic friends to lovers situation. So I feel like that could be really, really well done if they are thoughtful about it. I do hope that this show somehow still pulls through and does justice to this story, but in the end, if it doesn't, we'll at least have this book, which, you know, the best Bridgerton book I've read, and I think a lot of people's favorite Bridgerton book as well. As always, thank you so much for watching. Still kind of shocking that people are willing to listen to me yap about a book for like 20 to 30 minutes. I really appreciate it. The next one in the series I'll be reading is Eloise's book, so stay tuned for that. It might be a while before I read it just because I am not particularly looking forward to reading it because so many people have warned me against it. But for you, I will soldier on. And of course, if there are other series or other books or shows that you want me to comment on, if that you would want me to make content on, let me know. But once again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.